Whenever a study is released about Jewish demographics and denominations, there's always a rush among rabbis and experts to figure out how best to spin the data, that they're doing things the right way. Reform Jews will shout, "Look, we're the biggest." And Orthodox Jews will proclaim, "Yeah, but we're growing." Only once have I ever seen every organized Jewish group rally around one single statistic with the same fervor. The study showing that people who attend religious services regularly live, on average, 4 years longer than those who don't. I joke, but not really, when I say that many of my colleagues were trying to figure out a way to leverage this data without sounding crass. Join a synagogue. Your life depends on it. The idea seems ludicrous, but with increasing scholarship about the devastating physical health impacts of loneliness, this seemingly absurd factoid, it starts to make sense. Loneliness and social isolation can be as bad for your physical health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The pandemic of COVID has exacerbated the epidemic of loneliness that was already underway. Now, I stand with our congregational decision to be virtual for the high holidays again this year, but the spiritual and relational cost of that decision is not lost on me. I have heard from so many of you about the pain of not being able to be in person with each other, how the isolation erodes our sense of self and purpose. And before you think that loneliness plagues only the older adults in our community, think again. The most lonely age demographic in our society, it's 18 to 25-year-olds. Throughout this pandemic, all of us have had to weigh the risk to our physical and emotional health by what encounters we prioritize. Now, some among us feel largely untouched by loneliness right now. Your bubble was enough to sustain you through the pandemic. Maybe you even relished the lack of commute and the quality time you got with loved ones that would not otherwise have been possible. Perhaps loneliness feels so distant from your life at this moment that it doesn't rise to any significant level of concern for you. But the epidemic of loneliness has massive social consequences beyond any one individual's health. Hannah Arendt, in her work analyzing the rise of Hitler and Nazi totalitarianism, that famous Jewish post-Holocaust thinker noted that the chief characteristic of a violent perpetrator is not brutality or backwardness, but his isolation and a lack of normal social relationships. The conspiracies and extremist movements that have arisen in recent years of incels and insurrectionists, political and religious zealots, they target and they feed on loneliness by filling void with purpose and connection, however misguided that purpose and connection may be. Loneliness is all of our problem, whether it personally touches us at this moment or not, because it tears at our social fabric, and because it has, or it will, touch us at some point. Religious community, and Judaism in particular, have long understood this, that existential loneliness is built into the human condition at certain moments of death, of loss, and broken relationships. And the moments in our lives where we are at the greatest risk of loneliness and isolation, tradition often has the rituals to make sure that we are seen. Rabbi Sharon Brous teaches a text from the Mishnah that exemplifies this impulse in our tradition from ancient times. According to Mishnah Midot, there was a prescribed way that you had to enter the ancient temple. Everyone who walked in started walking on a circular path to the right. But if you were in mourning, or if you had been excommunicated, or were experiencing some rupture in your life, you were compelled to enter and walk to the left. The two groups would intersect. And the regular folks were supposed to ask the mourners and the excommunicated, "Ma lach?" What's going on with you? As Rabbi Brous notes, the rabbis construct a system of ritual that is engaged on profound psychological insight. When we have suffered loss, when our hearts break with worry for someone we love, somebody who stands in limbo between life and death, when we get a diagnosis and we show up at a work party or a friend's birthday or at the supermarket, it often feels like the whole world is moving in one direction, but that we are moving in another. How powerful. The whole world is moving in one direction, and you are moving in another. But that's not the only thing about this ritual that speaks to this moment. First, it does not pathologize singlehood. The ancient ritual lifts up two categories: the mourner and the excommunicated, those who feel rejected and isolated. And conspicuously absent is marital status. Today, our society equates singlehood and loneliness as one and the same. But there are singles with deep friend networks that meet their emotional needs, just as there are marrieds struggling with isolation and strained partnerships. Loneliness is an emotional condition when we do not feel understood. We pathologize the unwed while holding up marriage as the cure for loneliness. But it's not. Second, what strikes me about this temple ritual of circling is that its power is only partially in the act of circling itself. The deeper power is in the response that it elicits. Ma lach, or ma lecha. What's going on with you? When religious community falls short in addressing loneliness, it's because we forget the second step. We assume that the ritual itself does the healing, that the act of showing your grief or your despair is enough. Now today, we no longer have the ancient temple and the prescribed paths to walk, but other rituals fulfill the same purpose. When the mourner tears her clothing or the ribbon, or stands up to say the name of their loved one during Kaddish, or in recent times adds it to the chat, it's a declaration of pain and of hurt. But these rituals also are only a trigger for the more important moment that follows, the act of empathy. Ma lach. What is happening in your life right now? Tell me what makes you hurt. A few months back, my husband and I were touring daycare facilities for our kid. And one woman who ran a daycare out of her home, she mentioned that she took the profession up after her husband died X number of years ago. It wasn't a statement designed to garner attention, just a factual one to explain the origins of her business. The rest of the conversation was professional and logistical. But when we passed by a photo of her and her husband as we were leaving the house, I pointed and asked his name. Her disposition shifted immediately. Like her guard was let down, her eyes lifted. She shared a couple of sentences about him, not much. And I ended with Zichrono Livracha. May his memory be a blessing. And that was that. But I could tell that those last 30 seconds were the most meaningful of the past hour to her. Small acts that show that we really see one another make an extraordinary difference. I have been taken by the way in which our services online during the pandemic, where the most important part of them happens in the chat on YouTube and on Facebook. The small check-ins that folks do with each other bridge together a community that has been separated by isolation for more than 18 months. And it turns out, if you are feeling lonely, the best thing that you can do to help your loneliness is to offer kindness to somebody else who shares your need. The best way to get from a narrow place, Min HaMetzar, to a wider expanse of hope is to pull someone out along with you. According to an authoritative book on the topic of loneliness by Patrick Williams and John Cacioppo, findings indicate that there may be something unique about attending regular religious services. Church attendance has often the added benefit of reinforcing family connections and providing trustworthy interactions with friends. And religions tend to focus on helping others rather than on being helped. This altruistic focus fosters feelings of self-worth and control while reducing feelings of depression. I quote this not as a surreptitious plug for Shabbat services, but in recognition that we actually do have the foundational tools and infrastructure to take on the loneliness that plagues so many of us. We help our own feeling of loneliness by showing care for others. But Judaism isn't a panacea for loneliness. While the rabbinic tradition we inherited after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago has done an extraordinary job at holding the lonely who are suffering from grief and losing a loved one, we did not carry forward the legacy for the excommunicated as well as we could have, for those who have been rejected or feel thrown aside, who have lost a job, who have moved away from their community to a new city, who are returning from prison or recovering from addiction, who are having a mental health crisis, experiencing infertility, going through a divorce, who didn't have the robust network to carry them through COVID. We seem better, or maybe we're just more comfortable at validating some forms of loneliness over others. And there are steps that we can take to change that, to build a community and a society that are just better at making people feel seen. That becomes more adept at recognizing people in a narrow place and giving a glimpse of a wider expanse. This year, we hope to make this bima, this sanctuary, this community, a place where more people feel seen, with aliyot given for pain as well as for joy, with blessings for chemotherapy and for hospice, and for milestones of sobriety and infertility journeys, with prayers through struggle and honors given when strength is needed, both virtual and in person. We hope that this place and this community will become one that you will turn to help hold you in your pain, where you can feel seen. But we cannot imagine that the rituals will do the work for us. They are simply an invitation for all of us to take notice. When someone offers a name for Misha Berach or for Kaddish, when someone tears up at their moment in front of the ark, when someone asks for a blessing, when someone looks uncertain about where they might be welcome to sit, when someone is more frustrated about parking than they should be. These are the modern equivalent of walking into a sacred space in the other direction from everyone else. And when we can turn these moments into sacred encounters that chip away at our collective isolation simply by challenging our reticence to engage with a question. Malach, tell me what is happening with you. there's an opportunity to make this community, to make your every day defined by small, sacred encounters. For us to reach out in our moments of loneliness and hold others in moments of theirs. For us to look up and see who is walking in which direction. Because we know that whatever our loneliness state is right now, it is not permanent. Because when we take loneliness seriously individually, as a community, and as a society, when we take each other seriously, when we choose to really see each other, that is the sacred formula to pull us min hamitzar from a narrow place and to be answered with expansiveness, bringing us to a more open space. Gemar Chatima Tova. May we all find our place in the book of life together.